Hey everybody, and welcome to another video from Electronic Armory. In this 3D game development video, we'll be creating a Minecraft-inspired character to show you how to create a basic character, rig that character, animate it, UV unwrap it, so that we can add different skins to it. We'll cover this in the next couple of videos, and then we'll import our new character in Unreal Engine so we can move it around and activate its different animations for idling, walking, running, and much, much more. So subscribe to the channel to get notified as I put out videos. Jump into the Discord, link below, to get help on your own projects. But let's get started. So we're going to keep the default cube here as kind of our character body, and let's look at a reference to visualize what we're going to build today. So we just have a Minecraft character here, so we're going to build the body out of a couple of different cubes, the legs, the arms, and the head. And then as you can imagine, we're going to rig it or add a skeleton to it so we can animate it, animate a walk, animate a idle cycle, and then UV unwrap it so that we can apply these different colors to the different parts of the mesh like we talked about in a previous video. So in order to keep this on the same screen, I'm actually going to go down to the bottom right hand corner of Blender, and right on this area here, what we're going to do is right click so that we can bring up this context menu, click on or hover over area and go to split horizontal or horizontal split, and get a good area there and click. And so this will duplicate the above view that we have in Blender. So we're going to click on this little button and go over to image editor because we're going to want to replace that view with an image editor. And this is what makes Blender so powerful so that we can customize it and basically make it do what we want. All right, so I have the reference image here as well as another one. And so we can just literally click and drag this in here and drop it into our image. And then we can roll the mouse wheel up or down to zoom in, and middle mouse click to pan and zoom, just like we did with our 3D view here. So middle click and drag, and this looks good right about there. And that way I can keep an eye on it and see what we're actually building. All right, so let's get started kind of building out the basic shapes of our character. You can see if I zoom in here that the legs are actually detached. They have a surface face here, as well as I imagine on the back end, and then these arms are independent. So we're going to be building these out of independent cubes. So this should go fairly quickly, but feel free to pause, rewind the video as necessary. So I'm going to hit the 1 on my number pad while my mouse is hovered over the 3D viewport, and that'll put us in front face perspective. And I'm going to roll my mouse wheel up and shift middle mouse wheel click so we can drag this up a little bit. All right, so these major lines here for the grid are going to be a meter each. And so we want our character to be about 160 centimeters or 1.6 meters, of course. So we're going to make this body part here kind of take up about half the screen, about half of the about 160 centimeters. So we can even go count up if we want to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this is going to be our line here. And that's going to be the top of our character's head. So I'm going to take the cube here, tab into edit mode, and then we never scale in object mode if we can help it. And we're going to scale this down roughly about there, get into object mode, GZ, and move it up to about there. And that looks a little bit too big. So we're going to just edit it until it looks good. I can even zoom in here. So again, our character is going to be about 160 centimeters tall, a little on the short side, but that's okay. And we're going to scale, and on the X axis, so hit the X key, move that in a bit, click S, Z, and maybe make it a little bit less tall. All right, so that looks okay for a body, but if we rotate it, way too thick. So scale, and then on the Y-axis, we're going to scale that in until it looks right about what our body is on our character. So that's why I have the reference open pretty much at all times. Okay, so there we go. And then what I want to do is I want to maintain the same width here for our arms and our legs so that when he's standing upright, that our width is matching all across all of his body parts. And his head's going to be a little bit wider. You can see his chin kind of comes over a little bit there. So we do want to make that a little bit wider. So what I'm going to do is go back into object mode, and then I'm going to hit Shift D and drag this down on the Z axis. So hit Z after you hit Shift D, and we're going to move that down, and it doesn't have to be perfect. His legs are detached, so we can leave a slight gap in there. We can hold down the shift key to get a little bit more accuracy, and we can get as precise if we wanted there on that. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to split this in half, so down the middle here, so we can make individual legs here. And we can, of course, what we could do is we could duplicate this, make it smaller, move it over, but again, I kind of have the different widths aligned, and so I am just going to maintain that. Okay, so I'm going to hit Control R and move your mouse until we get a vertical split as opposed to a horizontal split. I'm going to roll my mouse wheel up to get 2, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale those down by hitting the S, and then X to just scale along the X-axis. And make sure you leave just a little bit of a gap there. And then I'm going to hit 3 on my keyboard so that I can select this face and then delete it. And we should be able to see a gap in there. So I'm going to delete this face as well. This face. And then I think we can get this face. There we go. Again, so we should be able to see between those two. And now the easiest way to put in if I scroll in here, so this one has a face on the inside, so we need to add that. I'm going to hit 2 to go into edge select, hold down shift to select both of these edges, F to connect them, and do the same thing for this leg as well. All right, so there's a bunch of ways that we could have done that, but that's just one way. All right, so I'm going to hit 1 to get my front face back. And we pretty much have the start of our character. Now, this is one mesh. We're going to eventually want to make it 2 different objects. So if I get out of edit mode, go into object mode, you can still see that this is one object. So another thing that we can do is go back into edit mode. And then I'm going to deselect everything by hitting Alt A. And then with my mouse hovered over one of these guys, I'm going to hit L. And that will select everything that's linked. And so you see that because those are separate meshes within the object, that it will only select that prism here. So there we go. I'm going to hit the P key on my keyboard, and I'm going to separate this by selection. So again, the things that are selected will be separated out into its own mesh, so that if I go into object mode, this is an object, and then this is an object. So I'm just hitting the G key to select those guys. All right, so now we have 2 different legs, and they actually do share a similar origin point. The origin point is right here. So you can see that little orange dot, that is our origin point. All right, so the next thing we want to do here is I'm actually going to select both of these legs, hit Shift D again to duplicate this, move it up, click, and then what we can do is I want to move this to be an arm, and I want to move, well, just one of these so that it is perfectly on this side. Okay, so then I'm just going to go into front face mode and hit GX and just kind of get this good enough. If you wanted to, you could actually model this as one object and then use a mirror modifier to get these exactly even. So let's take a look at a reference. His arms are pretty beefy compared to his body, so I think we're okay there. All right, we're going to do one more thing. Shift D up in the Z direction, get it to about there. I'm going to go into front face mode and go into edit mode so that we can scale this down until we have something that looks right about ahead. I'm not worried about the width right now. I'm going to move it in object mode, and our line should actually be here. So all right, I think that looks okay. I think his arms are a little wide, so let's go ahead and I'm going to scale this down in edit mode, of course. So scale along the X. And you can see that our other arm is not being scaled down, and that's okay. And I think that looks okay for right now, for our purposes anyway. Trying to keep this too simple, otherwise the video would be way longer. I'm going to move this in edit mode so that we maintain that origin there. and then go into object mode. All right, so for these arms, it's actually pretty easy just to delete this one, and instead of Shift D, I'm going to hit Alt D, and Alt D will duplicate it. You can see that our origin is flipped there. I'm going to hit X to maintain that X origin there, and then I'm going to rotate it along the Z-axis 180 degrees so that our origin's on the other side, and then GX to move it back. Again, this would be a great use for a mirror modifier. All right, so we could play around with this. This doesn't quite look like a Minecraft character, but we're getting there. So I'm going to hit 3 to go into front face mode. I'm going to select these two faces, hit S, Y, and scale this out to a little bit past his chest there. All right, so this is looking like a character now. Obviously the proportions are probably not exactly the way we want it to be, but again, we'll keep it simple. But yeah, just until you're happy with it, play around with it. But when you're happy with it, we can start rigging this up. All right, so when you got the proportions correct that you think you're happy with, we can start rigging the character by adding an armature. So we'll make sure we're in object mode, hit Shift A, go down to armature, and then add an armature. And it should add it where the 3D cursor is. If your 3D cursor is not at the origin, you can set the 3D cursor there before adding the armature. All right, and so I broke these pieces out into their own objects so that we could easily manipulate them. But what we actually want to do is make this into one unified mesh. So I'm going to select everything that's in here and then hit Control J. And that will actually join all of those objects into one mesh. So if I grab this, you can see it's one object now. I go into edit mode, and these are individual pieces within the same mesh. I'm going to go back into object mode, select our armature, and we can't see it right now. So what we're going to do is go into Object Data Properties, Viewport Display, and select this checkbox that says in front so that this is always in front no matter how we're looking at it. All right, in Unreal Engine, it's always a good idea to have a root, and that root is usually at the bottom of our screen here. So what we're going to do is we're going to select our armature, we're going to go into edit mode, and we're going to scale this down or just grab the tail and move it down along the Z-axis. And it doesn't really matter the scale at this point. I'm just going to keep it down so we don't really see it. And let's see, looks like our feet are not exactly on the ground, but that's okay. We can go and fix that really quickly. So you can try to get this perfect by going into front, G, Z, kind of selecting it, zooming in, trying to get it that way. However, the way I recommend it is to make sure that your origin point, which is currently right here in the face, set that to the origin of our scene here, and then we can actually put these faces at 0, 0, 0. So the reason I'm covering this is because you want to make sure that your mesh is set up properly, everything, all your ducks are in a row, so that a lot of these things become easier later on down the road, such as trying to align the feet to the ground. So in object mode with the object selected, I'm going to go over to Object, Set Origin, Origin to 3D Cursor. And again, hopefully your 3D cursor is at 0, 0, 0. If not, you can always go to the 3D cursor location and set it here. Okay, so that's under View. Hit the N key to make it show or disappear. Now in edit mode, we can go back to those feet, open N again to get this menu, go to Item, and you can see we're pretty close, but not exactly. So let's set the Z-axis for these faces, these two selected faces, to 0, and now we know that those are on the floor. So again, it's pretty important to set all these things up so that you can get pretty accurate. All right, so back in object mode, select our armature, go back into edit mode here. And what we're going to do is set this up as a skeleton where the different components of our character move. This one doesn't have any elbows or knees, which makes it a little bit simple, but the idea is we're going to want to have a joint here, a joint here, a joint here so we can move his head and twist it. And then we're going to have a joint that comes across here, and then we can rotate along these points here. And again, if this was a more complex model where we had elbows and fingers and everything, we would add way more bones. But again, let's keep it simple. So on this one, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to hit the E key to extrude this up, and I'm going to actually put this, restrain it to the Z, and put this somewhere about here. However, I don't want this big bone right there. I actually want to detach this and kind of move it up here, but you can see the root bone is still following this, what I'm going to make, the hip bone. So I'm going to hit escape to get out of that. I'm going to hit the Alt P key to disconnect the bone. It will maintain, if I go over to the outliner here, we can see that we have our bone structure. We have the bone, which is our root bone. We can actually rename that now. And then we have our hip bone. Or you can call it spine or whatever you want to do. So you can see that our hip bone is still a child of our root bone, but if we hit the G key, we can still move it around. And so you can see that there is a dotted line that just tells us that this is still parented to that root bone. So I'm going to hit the Z key, move this up, and we can actually just make this one big spine. I'm going to hit the 1 key so we're a little bit more accurate. GZ, and put it right about there. And so this is going to be our pivot point. So if we have him do look up and down, but mostly we're just going to have him twist his head. So we're going to use this as a axis. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a clavicle, basically, or a shoulder, and we're going to put that right in line here, maybe a little bit lower so that he uses this as the axis and not using this as the axis. But it's up to you how you want your character's arms to move. We're going to ignore the left side for right now, but in order to make this easy on us, I'm going to just do the right-hand side, and then I'm going to duplicate that or symmetrize it over to the left side. So in order to do that, I got to name our bones appropriately. So I'm actually going to rename this instead of hip to spine, because our model's a little bit more simple. And then this one can be, let's expand our view here, clavicle underscore. And this is his left clavicle. It's on our right, but it's his left. So we'll keep it underscore L. And then with this tail selected, I'm going to hit E and then Z to keep it right in the middle there. I'm going to put that right about where his end of his hand should be. Select this bone, open up our outline here, or you can go into the bone properties and change it there. So it's just going to keep the name that it previously was. And I'm going to call this arm underscore L. Going down to the leg, now what I want to do is have the leg rotate right about here. You can see in our reference image, his hip is kind of right there. It's a little bit detached from his actual body there. If our pivot point was up here, then more of his leg would actually go up into the body. See, right here it's kind of clipping a little bit, but not too much. So we're going to keep that pivot point a little bit lower. Now what you might think you would do here on this lower spine is drag it out here and then drag out a leg bone. And you can certainly do that. However, we don't actually need this particular bone here. It's not used. So we could delete it, but that'll mess up the parenting of our leg bone. So instead what I'm going to do, hit Control P and set keep offset. Now this keeps this leg bone parented to this spine. You can see that it's actually to the tail, which doesn't make sense visually, but that's going to be okay because we're just going to move this leg independently. So again, there's lots of ways to rig this, but we'll just keep it simple. I'm going to select this kind of hip bone, whatever this thing is, hit X, select bones, and we're going to delete that bone. All right, next thing we're going to do is just make sure our bone is named appropriately. So I'm just going to call this leg underscore L, and then create one more for the head. Select the spine, hold down Z, and just drag this. And essentially what this is going to do is this whole arm, for example, as we move the bone, it's going to move the mesh around it. As we move the head, namely just to spin it around, we'll move this bone, and then the leg, you can see how that pivots. Okay, so let's name our bone appropriately. Again, keeping everything organized now will help us later, because now what we can do is hit the A key to select all of our bones, go up to armature, go to symmetrize, and it will flip those over because, again, we have our bones named appropriately. We just have one head because we didn't add an underscore R or L. You can start on the left side like we did and symmetrize it to the left, or excuse me, to the right, or start on the right and symmetrize it over to the left, depending upon what your preference is. Okay, so now we have a head. We can move it around, and you can see it doesn't really do anything at the moment. I'm going to hit escape to get out of that. All right, so once we have our armature set up, just like we did in the last video when we set up animations for our door, you can kind of see how this resembles our door. The next thing I want to do is actually go into side mode by hitting 3 on the number pad, just to make sure our bones are in the middle. And this will kind of just help us animate it and move it around and pose it, just to make sure our bones are kind of all in the center and acting like bones. I'm going to go into object mode, and then I'm going to select the mesh first, and then the bones, and I'm saying that this body is going to be controlled by the bones. Hit Control P, and just like we did in our last video, what we're going to do is just keep with automatic weights. And that's it. That's how we add a armature to our mesh. So let's do some basic animation. So I'm going to go into pose mode. You can choose that mode using the select menu up here. So make sure you're in pose mode. And then with those automatic weights, we can see if we rotate this along the x-axis that he moves his arm. Now this is kind of the point where I might want to get rid of these bones. So I'm going to go into the object data view and uncheck that in front. I'm still in pose mode, so I can still rotate that bone. You can see the bone's kind of sticking out. And oftentimes what animators will do is they'll make custom controls for these bones and they'll stick them outside of the mesh, so it makes it a little bit easier to control that armature. All right, so if you look at this, you can see that his arm is distorting just a bit, and that is due to the automatic weights. So just like we did in the last video, we're going to kind of clean up the different weight paint so that we can make sure that this bone that's in his arm controls this entire mesh. So select the mesh, go up to weight paint, and then what you can do is select the bone that you want to weight paint for. So I want to select this left arm bone, and so I can select it here into our vertex groups. So that will be the, let's see, where is it? The arm left, and you can see that up kind of near the back here, the bone is not affecting this part of the mesh as much. So as we rotate it this way, you can see that this part kind of stays a little bit more horizontal than this part. This is more vertical. So as we add more weight to this mesh, and it only works on vertices, so I can click all in the middle here, but it doesn't work. If we wanted to have a little bit more detail in our deformation, what we'd want to do is add more vertices here, but we just have vertices here, so I'm just going to kind of paint this up a little bit, and you can see the mesh is moving as we handle that. All right, you can see it's still not perfect, and that's because it's probably being influenced a little bit by our spine or our clavicle. Yeah, it's the clavicle. All right, so then what we're going to do is go into our tools menu, and instead of blending for the mix, what we can do is just subtract. And we're going to subtract just this arm, and you can see as we paint these vertices or remove the weight from the vertice, it becomes more of that prism that we were looking for. However, I do want the spine bone, which is currently selected, to influence this entire body, so we can go back to add and make sure that we add in those vertices to the weight painting. I'm getting a little bit messy there, so we can just make sure that we select just the right vertices, which I'm not doing, but we'll fix that. Okay, so I made a small mistake. I had the clavicle selected when I weight painted that. So I'm just going to go ahead and redo this for the spine. All right, there's a little bit easier ways of selecting all these vertices and then doing the weight painting on that, but I just wanted to kind of show you the simple way and just make sure that our spine is selected when you do that. All right, so then I'm just going to go ahead and finish up our weight painting and see you after that. Alright, so we have our basic weight painting done. You can see that as I select the different vertex groups that correspond to the names of our bones. You can see which part of the mesh that they will affect. And so some of our bones don't actually affect any of our mesh, which is okay. And again, we might want to delete those later, but you can get the idea of, as we select the different bones, what part of our mesh that they control. So we're in weight paint mode. I'm going to get back into object mode, select our bone structure here, our armature, and go into pose mode. And we can kind of pose our character and start in on our walk cycle. That'll do it for this video. Next video, we'll start animating our character in a basic walk cycle. We'll add in a idle animation, so as the character is stopped and not moving, he kind of sways back and forth, so it looks like there's a little bit more dynamicism to him. And then we'll move into UV unwrapping so that we can apply different skins to him to be either our main character, a monster, or some other character within the game, simply by swapping out those images on the same exact mesh. We can share those animations across all those different characters because not only will they share the same armature, they'll also share the same mesh. So look forward to those videos. Hit the subscribe button if you want to see those videos. Hit like if this was useful to you, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks.